The floor of the bunker trembled as artillery struck closer than ever before. Dust fell like ash from the low concrete ceiling. Each blast above sounded like the end, yet it wasn't. Not yet. The man seated alone in the dimly lit study no longer flinched at the tremors. He barely blinked. His hand, jittering from Parkinson's, clutched a fountain pen he hadn't used in hours. The ink had dried, but he still held it, like a relic of a world that no longer existed. Adolf Hitler's empire was dying. The bunker's air was stagnant, saturated with smoke and sweat and dread. Its walls were thick, but the truth had begun seeping through them. The Reich was gone. His generals had lied, his armies had collapsed, and now, just above this labyrinth of concrete, Soviet boots marched through the ruins of Berlin. The map of Europe that once hung on the wall now looked like a joke. The once proud red markers were scattered, misplaced, overrun. No more offensive lines, just jagged ruptures, fronts that had folded in on themselves, like wounds left to rot. Entire divisions had ceased to exist without a word. What remained of the Nazi high command had become a theater of shadows, huddled deep underground, dragging out the final days of a dead regime. Outside, Berlin was no longer a city, it was a battlefield. Entire blocks reduced to rubble, trees shredded into splinters, fires danced through what had once been homes. And through the broken streets came the relentless advance of the Red Army. Tanks clattered down avenues that had once hosted parades. Now they crushed bricks, glass, and bones alike. Inside the Führerbunker, time dissolved into dread. The clocks still ticked, but no one counted the hours anymore. People whispered. They drank too much. They smoked until their fingers stained yellow. Some laughed too loudly, others cried when they thought no one was watching. The end was coming, and everyone knew it, but no one knew how it would arrive. On April 20th, Hitler turned 56. There was no celebration. The day passed with stiff handshakes and empty words. Bombs fell in the distance, a grim chorus marking the collapse of all he'd built. That night, he summoned Albert Speer. The architect had defied his orders, refused to implement the scorched earth policy that would have destroyed Germany's infrastructure on command. Hitler listened. He nodded. And then, in a moment of unsettling calm, he forgave him. Not because he had changed, but because none of it mattered anymore. Days bled into one another. Hitler's appearance had deteriorated. His skin had gone pale and slack. His gait was unsteady. His temper, once volcanic, had turned bitter and erratic. He lashed out at invisible enemies, traitors, cowards, conspirators. The reality that his armies were gone, his people starving, his legacy reduced to ash, was too much to bear. He still held meetings, issuing delusional orders to divisions that no longer existed. "Steiner will counterattack," he'd said, pounding his fist on the table. His officers had gone silent, eyes lowered. They knew the truth. There would be no counterattack. Steiner's forces were in retreat, if they were even still alive. Joseph Goebbels remained loyal to the bitter end. He brought his wife Magda and their 6 children into the bunker, sealing them all inside with him. The children laughed and played in the hallways, unaware that their world was ending. Eva Braun never left Hitler's side. She danced to scratchy records, poured wine, told jokes no one laughed at. She had chosen this ending. For years, she had lived on the fringes of power, never quite a wife, never quite a mistress. But now, in the bunker's dying light, she would finally be his equal. The tension reached a breaking point on April 28th. News arrived that Heinrich Himmler, the SS chief, had tried to negotiate surrender with the Western Allies. Hitler flew into a rage. His most loyal enforcer, his faithful Heinrich, had betrayed him. The last illusion of control shattered. That night, Hitler dictated his political and personal testament. Traitors were condemned. Loyalty praised. He left instructions for the continuation of the Nazi government, knowing full well there would be none. Then he turned to Eva. They would marry before the world ended. The ceremony was brief and surreal. A civil servant, hastily summoned from the surface, conducted it in the bunker's map room. Eva wore a simple blue dress. Hitler, hunched and trembling, mumbled his vows. When it was over, he kissed her cheek and limped away. The next morning, he called for Dr. Haas and Heinz Linge. He wanted to test the cyanide capsules provided by the SS. They used his beloved dog, Blondie. She convulsed violently and died within seconds. Hitler watched with cold eyes. The capsule worked. That was all that mattered. Around 3:30 p.m. on April 30th, Hitler and Eva had their last meal together. Spaghetti and a light salad. She barely touched it. He ate mechanically, staring into the distance. When the plates were cleared, he stood and nodded. Heinz Linge followed him to the sitting room. Eva walked beside him. She was calm, eerily calm. She sat on the small sofa. Hitler stood for a moment longer, then reached into his coat pocket. The cyanide capsule gleamed between his fingers. Eva bit into hers first, swallowing quickly. Hitler placed the capsule in his mouth and raised a Walter pistol to his right temple. A muffled crack echoed through the bunker. Linge burst into the room. Eva was slumped against the armrest, blue froth at her lips. Hitler's body lay beside her, the pistol still in his hand. Blood trickled down his cheek, pooling on the carpet. The room went still. The bodies were wrapped in blankets and carried upstairs to the garden behind the Reich Chancellery. The wind howled. The earth was torn and cratered. Soviet shells exploded nearby. There was no ceremony, just urgency. The bodies were placed in a shallow ditch, doused in gasoline, and set alight. Flames swallowed them, reducing the most powerful man in Germany and his last companion to smoke and ash. Back in the bunker, silence took hold. Word of the deaths spread in hushed tones. Some wept, others drank. A few whispered prayers, but most just stared at the walls, wondering if they'd be next. Goebbels seized what power remained. He refused to flee. On May 1st, Magda drugged her children and crushed cyanide capsules between their teeth as they slept. Later that evening, she and Joseph walked into the garden and ended their own lives. By May 2nd, Soviet troops had overrun the area. They stormed the Reich Chancellery and discovered the bunker beneath. What remained was debris, bloodstains, and the stench of smoke. The bodies of Hitler and Eva were gone, burned beyond recognition. The Soviets collected bone fragments and dental remains. Years later, Stalin would withhold the truth, fueling decades of speculation. In the streets above, Berlin lay in ruins. Survivors stumbled through rubble, their eyes hollow. Children dug through trash for scraps. The war in Europe would end within days. On May 7th, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The radio crackled with the announcement. In cities across the continent, people danced in the streets. But in Germany, there was only silence. Hitler's dream of a 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12. What began with fire and fury had ended in a bunker, surrounded by crumbling walls and dying embers. His empire left behind 60 million dead, entire nations shattered, and scars that would never heal. The Führerbunker was later sealed, buried beneath the streets of modern Berlin. No monument marks the spot, just a patch of grass behind an apartment complex where tourists pass without knowing. There is no tomb, no shrine, no resting place, only the echo of a final gunshot in the depths of the earth. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.